I spoke to sport integrity expert Dr. Catherine Ordway about this situation and what it means for the cleanliness of our swimmers and athletes.
That is a problem, and it's been known to be a problem for probably 10 or 15 years, where they've done a lot of research with a bunch of different manufacturers that are offering different supplements, and athletes are using them, but thinking that they're clean, but they're not, because we're finding that up to a quarter of the supplements have something inside them that's not on the label.
But they're getting advice, are they not? Once they're entering these careers, and once you're on the pathway to, well, being in nationals, let alone an Olympian, surely they're told avoid this stuff. Is this on athletes to just take this more seriously?
Absolutely it is. And the message that ASADA and the other anti-doping agencies are saying is food first. You don't actually need supplements.
Right.
It's really psychological, I think, which is the reason why people use them. Maybe they're using them to supplement something that they're not getting in their diet, if they're vegetarian or something like that, and they need a protein mix or something like that. But generally speaking, the nutritionists all say, food first. Get a decent night's sleep, drink your water, train hard. You don't need a supplement.
Yeah, which is what you're told about a lot of different vitamins anyway. The drug itself, what can that do, or how can that help athletes?
The idea of why it's been put on the prohibited list is because it's essentially a steroid, and so it's obviously going to be something that they need to put on the list. But the message that we got from ASADA in November is that they're finding it in the supplements, not on the labels. So somehow or another it's getting contaminated, probably during the manufacturing process. Right. And that means that athletes are really at high risk of getting something in their system that they didn't intend to.
Even if it's trace, so something else in the factory is using this particular thing and it gets in there somehow.
Exactly.
How much onus should be on companies, for example? I mean, if it's a peanut situation in the factory, it may contain traces of peanuts. Is that another avenue to go down?
Absolutely, and Australian manufacturers have the standards that you would expect, but when the supplements are coming from other countries, the Therapeutic Goods Administration or the other bodies in Australia that do assessments about nutritional foods and so on that come into Australia, they're not testing everything that comes in. They're not testing our, milk products that have come from China. Do you remember there were issues with that, or the berries and so on that come in? They're not checking every batch, and I think that's the problem. When they're an Australian manufacturer, they're working at a particular standard, and we would say you can trust that standard. But when it's come from overseas, who knows?
Now, nearly every time a swimmer or athlete is caught in Australia or anywhere else, they seem to have an explanation. It might be the contamination. It might be, Shane Warne had a tablet from his mother, of course, infamously. Do we just need a zero-tolerance approach? Because, as I said, there's always some explanation. I'm not saying that it's not the case, whatever percentage of time, but if you want both a clean sport and perception of cleanliness, then you just need to say, sorry, there are no excuses.
Well, sometimes the reasons are legitimate because they are taking a medicine for a proper therapeutic use, and there's been some mess up with the paperwork. There's been cases around the world from a whereabouts point of view because not providing information about where you are 1 hour a day, 3 months in advance is an anti-doping violation.
Because you're avoiding the testing.
Exactly. Yeah. Or not being where you said you would be for that 1 hour is also an anti-doping rule violation. Something happens, there's a car accident, there's some catastrophe that goes on in your family, and you don't remember to notify the anti-doping authorities. You have to have some sympathy and some...
Right. But that's an explanation, I guess, rather than simply... I didn't know. These types of excuses that we often hear.
Ignorance,
as brutal as it might be, I mean, she's 20 years old and people say her career might be over.
I know.
It sounds brutal, but it's hard for us to sort of pontificate on one hand and then say, give her a break.
Well, this is part of the criticism, I think, of Australians, is that we are more sympathetic and empathetic for our own athletes, but then when we look at athletes around the world, then we say, oh, well, maybe they're a bit dodgy. And I think that's unfair. If you take the nation out and you just look at the facts, then you have to say, well, is this fair or isn't it? Because calling someone a doping cheat is a really massive slur on their reputation. So we do have to be careful that we've got it right.
Well, that brings us to Sun Yang, of course. If you look into his history, there was a time he was found with a prohibited substance, but, and correct me if I'm wrong on these details, it was essentially right at the lower end. It was something banned 2 months before and could be something used with permission. Now, I know I just said zero tolerance, but does that highlight that that particular offence was legitimately a low-end one?
That's exactly what I mean. And we saw that with the Maria Sharapova case too, if you remember, where Sun Yang actually has a therapeutic use exemption, which is a proper permission now for that heart medication because he does have a diagnosed condition, and the tribunal accepted that. So
you want someone to be able to swim if they've got that condition.
Absolutely. And so he has got permission now to use it, but in 2014, when he went positive for that substance, he didn't have the paperwork in place. And that's exactly what I mean. Legitimate condition, everybody accepts that, and that's fine. Maria Sharapova, similar case, where they put the ban in on the 1st of January. She wasn't aware. She should have been. Zero tolerance. She should have been aware. But then she went positive a few weeks later.
What's your view? I mean, one example has often been the Tour de France and just how many people over the years have been found quite clearly cheating with none of these normal explanations out there. And we've had less of that lately. We get maybe a lot more headlines around this stuff recently, but probably testing has become better. What's your view on how if things are more clean or less clean than they used to be across various sports?
I think they're more clean, and that's because we've got more tools in the toolbox, if you like. So we really only had education of athletes, tell them that it's the wrong thing to do and tell them what the rules are, follow the procedures, and then do the testing. The testing has improved, no doubt. From the Sydney Olympics onwards, we were able to test for EPO, erythropoietin, which is what the cyclists at the Tour de France were using. But also on top of that, we've got the relationships with policing now. So we can share intelligence, we can share investigation techniques and so on. We can stop things at the border. So we can look at who's trafficking, who's distributing these drugs, whether it's going to the doctors or the coaches and so on, and we can nip it in the bud much earlier.
And a lot will know that samples can be used later.
Absolutely,
so that even if the old adage of, the criminal staying one step ahead of the cops, they know that they could be ruining their careers, sued as well in the case of Lance Armstrong.
Yeah.
And does that serve as maybe a bigger disincentive as well for athletes? That if you get away with it on the day, you might not get away with it 5 years later.
I think you're exactly right. Because they can hold the samples in the freezer for 10 years, we've been seeing a number of athletes that have been banned retrospectively. So that's a really important deterrent. And we've seen a bunch of athletes, even as recently as this week, get banned from the London Olympics. So you think you're never safe. You don't know what the technology is going to be like in 10 years' time, so you're really running a huge risk.
We'll see what happens with Shayna Jack and, of course, Sun Yang as well. But thanks for your time.
Very welcome, Tom.